There we go. Okay.
Rock and roll.
Yes, introduce yourself.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Edwin Council. I'm billed up there as Director of Education for the Church in Wales. I'm not a lawyer. I'm married to a lawyer, and that's far more than enough for me. My background is actually in history. I'm a history graduate, and subsequently theology. I'm an Anglican priest, actually. And I run the education service for the Church in Wales. So basically, we run a school service of 165 schools and about 25,000 children in Wales. So I'm coming at this not as a lawyer. I'm coming at it as a user of law in Wales. I suppose a sort of consumer in many ways. I suppose at the heart of this is that my role working with largely education law, there's two ways you can do it. I mean, a response to law is often just reactive. You know, law is there, you work with it. From my point of view, I suppose it's part of my toolkit, because I use law to make policy, and so it sort of moulds and shapes the work that I do. And because of that, I work a lot with local and with national government, the Welsh Government in Cardiff Bay. And I'm actually involved in making some of the law. Obviously, if there's a bill going through the Assembly or whatever, I mean, classic case, I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go through, working with the bill team actually in Cardiff Bay to say, yes, you know, this is what the law needs to do. So I suppose, in a sense, it's as law in Wales starts to gather momentum, it's got to become law that's made and shaped to do the necessary in Wales. So I'm giving this a bit of context in a few ways. I'm going to give you sort of three recurring themes. As Karen said, don't feel free completely to disagree with me. I'm not coming at this as a lawyer. I'm coming at this as a historian, as somebody who uses law. But there are three sort of themes that I'm finding recurring on this. First of all, that law emerges often from political expediency. You know, in order to solve a political problem, law in Welsh history often is the thing that makes the political happen. That might be Henry VIII trying to secure a union to stop people invading. In the same way, you've got a coalition government in Westminster, you've got a Labour government in Cardiff Bay. The law has to look different politically. So there's an expediency about the way that law is produced that I think you see time and again in the history of Wales. Second one is that Wales has a history of developing law that is actually distinctively Welsh. It serves a Welsh context. And that's something that pops up time and time again. And third, I'd say that Wales has repeatedly been on the cusp of developing its own political system and consequently its own legal system. And every time it's got to a threshold, it's pulled back. It's either not had the confidence or it's been taken over effectively by the situation of UK. And I suppose my premise and my thing I want to leave you with at the end of where we'll get to is that in 2014, is it any different to what's gone on in the cycle of Welsh history? Now we've got a law-making body in Cardiff Bay. Are we actually on the cusp of doing something actually that's distinctively Welsh and actually having a confidence and a momentum? Or actually, are we going to pull back and just go straight back into the cycle of just being subsumed, absorbed again within the UK? So that's basically where I'm coming from. Are you all right for a video clip at YouTube for 2 minutes? It's fun if it works. If it doesn't work, I'll just look silly, but we'll battle on regardless. Let's see if it works. And where's it gone? Is it going to work? This is typical, isn't it? Hang on. No, that's not going to do it. Practice where we're at. Come on. This is going to work. It's an old one. those were the days, eh? Right, that great prophet of our times, Kelly Jones, as long as we beat the English, we don't care. Trivial and flippant, I know, but just hold it in your minds, because there's something about that in the way that Wales develops its own identity. And you can trace that back through various times in Welsh legal history. I'm not going to give you a chronology through Welsh legal history. I'm going to pick a few points during the process and actually look at the ways in which individuals have actually started to pick up those themes about how Welsh identity is enshrined, is actually expressed through law. Back in the 1950s, if you had the Encyclopaedia Britannica and you looked up the word Wales, you would see, for Wales, see England. Interesting way of looking at things, isn't it? Somebody once said if Wales was flattened out, it'd be bigger than England. We have a strange sense that folks funded ourselves as a nation in Wales, and yet Wales has always been seen as that little bit on the western flank. I remember once, not many years ago, going to a meeting with some colleagues in England, and it was the issue being discussed was actually something pertinent to England, but they've actually, in the diagram that was up on the PowerPoint, Wales had just been cut off. And the UK looks very, very strange when you take Wales off and you're just left with England and Scotland. And yet there's an overriding view, I think, that actually sees Wales as being this western flank, almost left there to hang on the Atlantic fringe. In 1188, a man called Gerald of Wales actually went round. He did a tour, went around the whole of Wales. It's a big enough job today. In 1188, it was a huge thing. He said in their musical concerts, they do singing in unison like the inhabitants of other country, but in many different parts. You'll hear many different parts and voices as there are performers who all at length unite with organic melody. Listen to a crowd at the Millennium Stadium. Yeah, it's impressive stuff, isn't it? Unknown source or unknown date when Edmund Blackadder said, have you ever been to Wales, Baldrick? Well, don't. It's a ghastly place. Huge gangs of tough, sinewy men roam the valleys, terrifying people with their close harmony singing. You need half a pint of phlegm in your throat just to pronounce the place names. Never ask for directions in Wales, Baldrick. You'll be washing spit out of your hair for a fortnight. Interesting, isn't it, when you see the perceptions of what Wales is like. If you're going to look at anything in the history of Wales, the context of Wales, it does a lot of it come back to the church. When we go on a little while shortly to talk about how old they are, the early lawmakers in Wales, a lot of them have the clergy alongside because it's back, have any of you done any canon law in terms of legal systems? I know Karen's done quite a lot of that over recent years. In terms of the law of the church, the structure of how law was put together, very much formed, very much focused on the church years ago. That's St. David's Cathedral. It's been there since the 6th century. So a centre of learning, a centre of organisation, consequently a centre of reference point of law in all sorts of ways there in West Wales. But of course the contradiction, I suppose, is that when you look at the way in which we come together as a nation in Wales, and the sorts of things that start to give a nation an identity. Because law, if it's going to be effective, has to come out of the identity of a community. It isn't something that can just be imposed. I mean, I'm very interested to see what happens in Ukraine over the next coming months, when Vladimir Putin is effectively going to impose a code of law over an area of sovereign territory from another land. Very, very difficult thing to do. You go and you put your laws in place, well, that's fine. You have to have very, very stiff sanctions where people deviate from that law. Law, organically, ought to be the thing that comes out of a community because it enables it to function. So, interesting to see how at various times Wales has done that, when law has been imposed in order to subjugate the name of Wales as a region, all the times when law has actually become organic. It's been the law expressed by the people of Wales in order to help the nation function. There, I suppose, in many ways, is a gathering point, a modern-day cathedral. And you take something like a rugby stadium where people come together to express their identity. The Millennium Stadium actually becomes a really interesting simile for what Wales is like. And what I want you to start thinking about today is, what does a code of law for Wales actually need to look like? Nobody who's there in the Millennium Stadium singing their hearts out with a belly full of ale when Wales are playing rugby is ever going to see themselves as being anything other than Welsh. There are plenty of people in Wales today who would argue that unless you were born within the boundaries of the ancient kingdom of Gwynedd, you're not Welsh. You try saying that to somebody from Anisabul on an afternoon of a rugby match. How do you actually define yourself if you're Welsh? Dare I ask, how many of us in the room consider ourselves to be Welsh? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? It's different things, different people. I was born in Birmingham, but I've lived in Wales for 40 years, so yeah, I'm more Welsh than anyone. I do want Wales to be in England. And gosh, but there's all sorts of different ways of expressing, identifying that Welshness. In an area that's actually not much bigger than a big English regional county, there's a huge variety going on. And yet we've got devolved government, law-making powers, really quite huge powers given the size of our nation. Right, first character we're going to think about, sorry that's not very clear, that is a coin of a guy called Offa. Offa being, connection anybody? Offa's...
Contract. Acceptance?
No, O-F-A.
I was just going to say.
No.
Yeah, Offa's Dyke, anybody?
Oh, right.
Anybody been to Offa's Dyke? It's a ditch. It's the boundary between Wales and England. Right? Offa was the king of Mercia. He built an earthwork right the way down Wales. First person to actually identify Wales and mark it out as being a separate place. What happened after that was you end up with Wales, again, divided up into various kingdoms. Don't worry too much about the names of the kingdoms. Many of them are familiar. Gwynedd up in the north there. Powys in the middle. Morgannwg down there. Residence for the University of South Wales. And yeah, it's all Gwent, the old kingdoms there. Wales in many ways was run by local kings. Local people with huge powers, and it served their purpose to keep order within each of the regions. We're talking here about probably around about the 8th and the 9th century, when there was, when local organisation just meant really keeping the peace, keeping everybody on side, keeping everybody organised. That was the way that you kept order, that was the way you kept organisation within the country. But if you ever want a lawmaker, this is somebody who you need to think about, and somebody who you need to think about researching. I started reading this round, spending reading about Hywel. How many of you have been down to look at the assembly down in Cardiff Bay? Yeah, have you been down there? Yeah, you've been to the new building, the Senate building. Just behind that, there is the admin centre. Anybody know what it's called? Sorry? Yeah, it's T. Hywel. Is the admin centre where basically all the AMs and all the admin staff work, named after Hywel. The first, actually the only ever recognised ruler in Wales to have been given the name the Good. He wasn't particularly good, he was a bit of a so-and-so really, ruled with a rod of iron. But it's actually the way in which he's remembered. History actually remembers him very, very fondly in Wales because of the way in which he brought about a system of organisation which actually left a legacy on Wales. You may well come across the laws of Hywel Dda. It was really the first sort of code of law that you would have seen coming out for the whole of Wales. A background to this, that's just one of the, as a PowerPoint there, just one of the things. So all the laws of Hywel Dda are actually all in the National Library. There were about 70 manuscripts in all, and they were largely written to enable the people of Wales to organise themselves. Very, very practical law. The earliest that they can be traced back to is to basically around the 10th century when Hywel Dda was running Wales. The way in which history has looked at Hywel Dda, some of the laws of Hywel Dda that are in the manuscripts kept in the National Library in Aberystwyth were probably written in the 18th century. They were written retrospectively. They were written because they looked back to this great figure of Welsh history. And gosh, this must have been the things that Hywel would have done. Essentially, what we know is he broke his laws down into two basic subsets. The laws of the court. Now, if you can imagine local authorities in Wales today, anybody know how many local authorities there are across Wales? There are 22. 22 small organisations to run things locally. In many ways, Howell established something like that. He had local rulers who would then exercise authority, keep control, start putting laws in place in local regions around Wales. Those were the laws of the court. They largely required the local leader to pay homage, service to Howell, as essentially the king, as the main ruler. So laws of the court, good organisation, laws actually to keep the main powerful people under control. You wouldn't have wanted any of those people to get above themselves, get any ideas of revolution, and Wales has had a lot of revolution over the years. No, let's get laws that mean that they're well resourced, they've got plenty of powers locally, everybody's doing fine. The laws of the country were different, and this is where I think you see for the first time a code of law starts actually to be law generated for the people of Wales. Family law. Now, the church was very, very powerful in around about the 10th century. The laws in Wales, though, were actually probably not that much approved of. For example, in the clause of Howell Dda, very interesting if you look at some of the family laws and some of the laws relating to women, whereas the church laws at the time would have been very much women in a place of subservience, you might well have a dowry. In Welsh law, it was great when you got married, there was a virginity fee which was paid, and there were various other fees that could be paid, or actually, in the law, you could just elope and get married. You could, equivalent of going off to Gretna Green, if you didn't want to go through all the rigmarole that the church requires. So it was very practical law. Church didn't like it at all, because it just didn't go with the rules. But they were basically laws for the people of Wales. Land law. Very interesting. Any idea what the system of land tenure was in England around that time? It would have been a Kentish system. Has anybody come across Cavalcade? It was a system of law whereby if somebody died, then inheritance would pass to the eldest son. In Wales, the system was, it was broken down and split between the family, which was great because it kept the kindred group together. Wales very much built on kindred. But of course, any ideas of the consequences of that? Somebody dies, it goes to all their kids, usually to the sons, I have to say. What would happen when they died? Split between their kids, the parcels of land become smaller and smaller. You don't actually get any concentrations of power, which served the needs of power and authority at the time, but also you don't get any build-up of wealth, you don't get leadership, if you like. Everybody becomes very subservient. Criminal law. Again, very, very interesting. It's well worth having a look at some of the laws of Howell Dda. There are plenty of them translated, you can get hold of them easily. As I say, the originals are in the National Library, in the archive there from the National Library archive in Aberystwyth. Criminal law was, again, very much built on family terms. If there was, for example, a theft, the courts under the laws of Howell Dda wouldn't just perhaps put a fine on an individual, it might be split between the family. It would go actually through cousins to 4 generations, when actually responsibility, paying recompense for what had been stolen or what had been damaged, would have been split amongst the family group. So again, another way actually in which the law became a way of actually keeping the peace. It wasn't just about the individual doing something. If you did something and broke the law, you knew it wasn't just about you. There was a knockback on your family, on your kindred, on the good name of your family around you. Some fascinating little details in there. There were actually rules and regulations about if you pinched somebody's cat. One of the things that the courts had to decide was whether it was a good mouser or not. If a cat caught loads of mice, there was a bigger fine to pay than if it was a kitten or something like that. Very practical laws. It sounds almost naive, it sounds simplistic, but it was actually law that enabled the people of Wales to get on and live their lives. It wasn't radical law in any way, it was never pushing any boundaries. It certainly wasn't aspirational, but it did actually enable the people of Wales to develop a code of law that enabled them to get on with it. Hold that in your mind and jump ahead to the early days of Welsh government law in recent years. Do you remember when the BBC, I don't know if you remember it, actually did a poll, and the people of Wales were given the chance to propose a law. Remember what the people of Wales voted to do? Who's paid 5p for a plastic bag recently? Isn't it interesting? It was actually the chance of the people of Wales to make a law. Tell us what you want us to make a law about. Might be about, well, it could be anything, couldn't it? Yeah, the people of Wales voted to ban plastic bags. Interestingly, it's been a knock-on effect now to other parts of the regions of the UK. It probably will become national law, and it's had a measurable impact, I think, on the environmental issues. But again, a really practical, seemed almost silly at the time. I think it's actually very much reflective of this sort of way in which the law was administered in the time of Hywel Dda. In terms of the administration of the law, under Hywel's system, there were judges, there were those who went around, different magistrates, would be the best way to describe them, and there would be local sessions. They would go around and they would hear all the cases. Again, it enabled Hywel to keep control. It meant there was a structure of organisation. You think back to that breakdown between the laws of the court and the laws of the country. Yeah, he needed to keep strong organisation. Think about the geography of Wales. Think about how difficult it is to have an administrative centre. If you wanted to organise Wales and actually keep control of it, where would you set up your headquarters? Any suggestions? Cardiff. That's fine. And in the 10th century, how long did it take for you to get to Cardiff to North Wales? It doesn't matter where you set up your administrative HQ in Wales, it's hours, days' journey to get anywhere. You need some very, very strong dependents working all the way around the country. You need them signed up. You don't want them going off script. You need law that enables them to administer the place. Laws of the country, very much there for the people of Wales to organise themselves. Well, legal legacy of Hywel Dda, yeah, I actually think there is a huge legal legacy, and I think you see that approach to law cropping up time and again. Really interesting, in the 17th and the 18th century, those who were trying to create a Welsh identity, because from the 18th century onwards, that was when people started to define what Wales was. When was the first Eisteddfod? Anybody know? 4th century? 5th century?
Oh, yes.
19th century. Here in Advent Haddo? It's an English folk song. Not the words, but the tune is an English tune. All of those towards the 19th, basically through the 19th century, an awful lot of Welsh culture was created. How long has Cardiff been the capital city of Wales? 1950s? It's all very, very new. They're actually looking to work out in the 50s, where are we going to put the capital? Where's the capital city going to be? One bright idea, they said, we'll draw a line from north-west Wales down to south-east Wales and north-east Wales down to south-west Wales, and wherever they cross, it's in the middle. It's somewhere around about Builth Wells, I think. The only problem was, once somebody did it with a really strange projection of Wales, and they crossed to the middle of Cardigan Bay. There isn't an easy way of doing this, and the Welsh identity, the Welsh culture, has in many ways been a very recent thing. It's always been there, but it's never actually been expressed as a national thing. Wales has always worked on the local, it's always worked in the regional. Only in very relatively recent times have we actually had a national identity. And I think there's something of the legacy of Hywel Dda. There was a code of law, there were laws for the people of Wales starting to be brought together. When you're looking at Welsh legal history, and I'm not going to go into any depth at all in these, there are a series of key figures. One of them was Edward I, King of England, responsible for building castles. Castles were there to be visible signs of everything that Hywel was doing with his laws of the county. Edward was coming in with a much more of an iron fist, and he really wanted to put down revolution. If you ever get a chance to go into Cardiff and go into City Hall, up by the museum, go in there and go up the stairs, and there's a statue of Llywelyn ap Griffith, who proclaimed himself Prince of Wales. Llywelyn died in 1282 when he was killed by some of Edward I's men. But he was the Prince of Wales, and it was the fact that somebody could proclaim themselves to be the local ruler that so horrified the King of England that he came down with an iron fist. Now, that's in the space of just a couple of centuries where you've had Hywel Dda with a system of delegating everything to the people of Wales, all of a sudden you've got an English monarch who's looking across and saying, well, no, not that I want to put my system of law over there. I actually need to establish security. Think about also the position of Wales, and this will come up time and time again. Western flank of the UK. This isn't just a Welsh issue, this is a UK issue. Wales is vulnerable to invasion. When was the last invasion of the UK?
1350 something?
I think it was, actually. I can't remember the exact date, but it was a French army who landed in Pembrokeshire. And they were frightened off by the local women, because they saw the big hats, apparently, and they were really terrified. No, it was an expeditionary force that the King of France sent. I think it was actually in the 14th century. And it was in Pembrokeshire. A very exposed western flank, back in the time of Hywel Dda, and those times it was often the Vikings who would come in. They would pillage, they'd plunder locally. But actually, once you get then really into around about the 12th, 13th century, very much just have the build-up of power of significant national powers in Europe, particularly in France and Spain. When you come up into the Tudor times, which we'll talk about in a moment, that Wales was the vulnerable western flank of the UK. So law, in a sense, is what came out of that. It was actually political expediency. Back to one of the premises I noticed you in the first place. That was why you needed to have control over Wales. All of a sudden, you're moving from law that's made for the people of Wales by the people of Wales to law that's imposed from outside, because the King of England, in that sense, needed to keep control. Let me go on to another significant point in Welsh history. Owain Glyndŵr, the last person to proclaim himself Prince of Wales. Owain Glyndŵr was very much caught up, actually trained in law, had been at the Royal Court in London, came back to Wales to find his heritage, to restore his heritage and find his identity. In 1400, he proclaimed himself to be the Prince of Wales. In 1401, he gathered a group of like-minded Welshmen together. In 1404 and in 1405, he established a Welsh Parliament. The King of England at the time was Henry IV. You just imagine Henry IV, who would have been just as concerned about the western flank of the UK being exposed. Can you imagine this whippersnapper, this upstart who's actually trained in the court in London, going back to his native land and then suddenly establishing a parliament? Didn't just raise the flag of revolution, though. He gathered a series, first of all, he gathered a series of clergy from across Wales. Why would he have gathered the clergy?
Power.
Power to some extent. Put your legal heads on, back to canon law, back to the cathedrals as the centres of law, and if you had the clergy involved there, they would actually have been the legal brains of the time, because they would be well versed in canon law, well versed in Latin. Back to Latin, he was talking to Professor Stuckey about. So he gathered actually the law-making ability that was in Wales at the time, when he had his parliaments in 1404 at Machynlleth and 1405 at Harlech. And that was effectively trying to work out what it would need to establish a means of regulation across Wales. Owain Glyndŵr was also the first person to actually have a Welsh foreign policy. He entered at the same time those parliaments were being gathered into an agreement called the Tripartite Indenture with two other rebel leaders, if you like, Edmund Mortimer and Thomas Percy. And they agreed that when they worked together with their combined forces to overthrow Henry IV, then Owain Glyndŵr would be the ruler of Wales, that would be his empire, and he would be the person who established law and authority across the region. The only problem was, of course, that you've got this the conflict again between what's going on in Wales, what's going on in London, or in England, I should say. What basically happened was that Henry IV said, with this I will no longer put, basically sent an army, and a crucial thing happened, because Owain Glyndŵr had put in place Parliament, he put in place a structure to give Wales law, and yet when the English army came, the people of Wales just drifted away from him and went back to doing what they'd always done. Went back to their villages, went back to ploughing the fields, doing whatever they did. In 1408, when Owain Glyndŵr fled to the hills, how many men do you think he took with him?
2 or 3.
But there's a story that he took 7. They were the only people who stayed with him. And there are various, you're then into the realms of legend about his death as to where he actually died, whether his own men turned on him or whether he was ambushed. But effectively there was somebody who was on the cusp of putting in place Wales with an identity and a system of law. And yet, when it was challenged, the people of Wales just seemed not to be bothered, drifted away. Let me jump ahead just a couple of hundred years. Henry VIII. Any of you do history in school? Any of you do Tudors and Stuarts? Yeah, it's either that or World War I in the history curriculum these days, I'm afraid. Right, Henry VIII, you'll start to see a bit of a recurring theme here. Okay, a few marital problems in there. Not that he was particularly on the search for the perfect woman for all his life, but actually so many of his, marriage was a way in which you made political allegiance, and of course, alongside that, if I say Henry VIII was paranoid, what was he paranoid about? His mother-in-law? He was often the Queen of Spain? No. Think of Wales, exposed west flank, threat of invasion. That was the obsession of monarchs of the UK for most of our history. Henry needed to have power and control. Yes, he was probably a megalomaniac to start with, but actually having a system of law in place to keep the people of the UK under control, the threat of invasion was constant coming in from the western flank. The result of that was 2 significant pieces of legislation, the Acts of Union. 1536, the first Act of Union, really undid a lot of the law that had been put in place structurally before. So I should have mentioned Marcher Lordships earlier on. The Marcher Lords were basically those who held the land down the frontier between England and Wales. If you think back to the time of Hywel Dda, those individuals who'd been actually resourced by law to be powerful rulers. They kept control locally. Henry VIII abolished the Marcher Lordships, and he put in place a different way of administering law. English civil and criminal law was suddenly applied throughout the country. So law made elsewhere, law made effectively in London, was now administered throughout the whole of the country. Wales having the same legal system as England for the first time. We've gone from law made by the people of Wales for the people of Wales, serving the local situation, all of a sudden law is now made elsewhere, and it's trying to do something very, very different. The Second Act of Union in 1543 put justices of the peace in place, a common system of local government, quarterly courts of courts of quarter session. So again, you've got very, very powerful people in the person of the law, of the justices of the peace, the local administrator of law coming through communities on a regular basis. Very much a law from outside. People of Wales administered by an alien system of law, but also administered by people coming into their communities. So very different to what they'd experienced in the past. But I think it's quite easy to get on a bit of a Welsh high horse, so more imposition of law from England. Also, Wales was getting its first MPs. It sent our first representatives to Parliament. But Wales was, in every sense, also recognised through the Acts of Union. There were now Welsh people, Welsh men as it happens, actually who became part of the law-making body in Westminster. So, in that sense, union wasn't just about imposing a code of law and imposing regulation on Wales, it was also trying to bring Wales within a coherent and single legal identity for the whole of the UK. That's the kind of ancient stuff, if you like, and I think, just to pause for a moment there, is it law for Wales or law for the Welsh? And I think constantly keeping in mind our current legislative situation where Wales has its own lawmaking powers, it has its own elected assembly, and yet still has, obviously, the connection to the UK government and all those legal powers we'll have a look at in a minute. But in many ways, you have those who've said, right, we need some law for Wales, because it defines what Wales is like, and others who've said, actually, it's law for the people of Wales, so that it organises, regulates the way that life in Wales is organised, administered every day. Any questions at that point? I'm going to jump ahead now. Hang on. Sorry, recovering from hand flu. Right. Oh. The original name of this wonderful institution that you're all in was?
Miners.
The Treforest School of Mines. Which sounds very, very strange today. And yet, in 1913, Wales exported more coal. In fact, more coal was exported through the port of Cardiff than any other port in the world. In Punch, which was a satirical magazine really at the height of it, and around the sort of late 19th, early 20th century, there's a picture of a cartoon in Punch, famous one, of a lady in a Welsh national costume carrying a tray, and it's got the world on it, and it's got a great big mouth, and it's chewing coal. And the caption on these says, "Little Wales feeds the world." When you think of the legacy of the Industrial Revolution and everything that was happening around about the late 19th, early to the early part of the 20th century, Welsh coal, you don't know too much about this, but it was steam coal. It was the stuff that ships ran on. So there was a huge demand for coal, and Wales had the right sort of coal that everybody needed. So massive expansion, massive growth. You just look around the communities of this area. If you've been here, well, even 20 years ago, there would have been pitheads and spawns heaps and everything. I mean, the whole regional economy really run on coal. I want to pick up just a couple of key people around this time. First one was David Lloyd George, a Welshman who was Prime Minister. Think back to the Acts of Union, the way in which for 400 years, you'd had, best part of 400 years, Wales had been subsumed within a legal identity that was totally English. Remember the first MPs going to Wales? Well, here you have a Welsh Prime Minister. There were very interesting things that were happening at that time. The historian in me is actually fascinated by this, because Wales was also a hotbed of radicalism. And so there were people who were actually challenging and trying to assert what the identity was of Wales, which was essentially a working class and a manufacturing culture. And yet those who actually ran the mines, those who ran the iron businesses, were often English, they were certainly wealthy, they were middle class, and there was a complete disconnect between those who were workers and those who actually took the wealth of the nation. David Lloyd George tried to put in place legislation that would give Wales an identity. The crowning glory of that being in 1920, it was an Act of Parliament to disestablish the Church in Wales, make the Church in Wales a separate entity. What a great thing to do. It didn't mean a thing to the people of Wales, though. In one sense, it was trying to take something that was identifiably English and make it Welsh. And actually, what had happened was that the Labour Party had emerged, and people had become radicalised, actually, initially, through the chapels, when a message of faith and a message of radicalism came together. So actually, out of that situation, you get a new political movement emerging. And because of that, you also get a lawmaking context emerging. Anybody recognise the statue?
Look at the NHS, what's his name?
That's right. Well, either eaten the McDonald's or felt hungover there and over the years, haven't we? Yeah, it's an Iron Bevan. And again, here's a man who had a vision for the NHS and put legislation in place that gave healthcare free at the point of delivery. I've got to be really careful because I can climb on no end of political soapboxes about everything of his vision being dismantled piece by piece at the moment. But that was his vision. And you lose that at your peril. Because that's actually a very Welsh way of doing politics. of looking around and actually seeing hard-working local people who actually need every bit of help they can get. How can we put some legislation in place that actually gives them an identity? And that's what an Iron Bevan, or Bevan as he was often called, that's what his vision of the NHS actually did back in the 1940s. So bear that in mind of two Welshmen who'd actually had a massive influence on politics, and also in their way, they tried to use legislation to give an identity to that. And this wasn't imposing legislation on Wales, this was Welshmen trying to put, actually speaking on the national stage, and trying to use that Welsh approach, if you like, to try to influence legislation elsewhere. Right, if you're of a tender disposition, look away now. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected as Prime Minister of this country. In 1979, you could travel from North Wales to South Wales without leaving Conservative constituencies, which is staggering. In the course of a generation, Wales had changed from being actually really quite a radical, nationalist, socialist country into actually Tory, true blue Tory. I'm just trying to actually think, I should look this up before I came today, as to how many Tory MPs there are in Wales today. I think there are 3. I think it's 3 of the there are 40 members of Parliament from Wales. I think 3 of them are Conservatives. It might be slightly more than that, but it's not very many anyway. Margaret Thatcher's appointment was very, very significant for a number of reasons. Because now you had actually a Prime Minister appointed with a mandate to bring about a radical change that shaped law and also shaped the politics of our country forever. Think back to our legacy of coal, and then think back to the miners' strike. Okay? And you think about the changes to things like trade union legislation, a lot of law was put in place in order that a political ideology came into being. This isn't about saying, right, what law do we need in order to enable to function? This is about the government coming in and saying, right, we have a political agenda, we have an ideology. What law can we put in place to actually make this happen? And there are communities across Wales today, well, across the UK today, when Baroness Thatcher died a little more than a year ago. I think we saw something of the kickback. Those of you who maybe this was history to you, you might well felt some of the bitterness that was very obvious in many communities as they remember the legacy of those really difficult days back in the 90s. Right, thinking a little bit about that. In 1979, there was also a referendum about Wales having its own devolved parliament. And the turnout in the vote was, you need to check this, but I'm pretty sure that the turnout was something like 25%.
Sorry, did you say
1979. It was the first referendum on devolution. And the people of Wales, on a very small turnout, voted 4-1 against. Now you take a quarter of the people of Wales voting, and a quarter of them actually put a tick in the box to say, yes, we want our own lawmaking powers, our own devolved government body. Doesn't it take you back to those other bits of Welsh history where the Welsh, when they left Owen Glyndŵr, there he was proclaiming himself as Prince of Wales, oh, we'll go back to the farming. No, absolutely no, no hunger for anything to be devolved, to be made identifiably Welsh. Ah, I've got coffee. Excellent. We've been thinking about the Welsh in their history. Just in a minute, just talk to the person next to you in 2s and 3s. What would you put in a legislative agenda, a framework for Wales? What would be your priorities? Just quickly, have a chat. Come up with just one thing amongst you as 2 or 3 groups. What would be your priority if you were making a legal code for Wales? What's the first thing you'd do? You've had plastic bags, you can't have those. Hi. Okay, any ideas?
Like introduce more of like primary industries again to try and make the economy boom, because Wales is much poorer per head per capita than England is.
Absolutely. But immediately, I mean, you've come up with things that could be to try and do legislation, but would actually have to have a great deal of political approval in order to do that, wouldn't it? So that might actually involve tax raising powers. You've got to get your money to do it somewhere. The budget for Wales this year, 15.3 billion. In 2006, it wasn't much less than that. It was about 14 billion, even back in 2006 when the first devolved budget for Wales came through. So there's an argument for tax raising powers in order to do that. One more. Anybody else? Any other ideas? So boost to industry.
Protecting our natural resources.
Right.
I'm sure that when you've got to have industry,
Yeah.
you also need to encourage tourism to come and see our green and pleasant land.
Yeah.
Because like I say, if you go to Harlech Castle and around that area, it's beautiful. There's stunning scenery and wilderness. And although that's not the threat, I know, it needs to be protected.
Interesting, one of the areas of legislative competence has been handed over to Wales, so actually the Assembly does have powers over that. There was a bizarre situation where they actually had control over fisheries, but only to a certain limit. So if you were a cod swimming up the Bristol Channel, if you went to the left, then you came under the fisheries regulations for Wales, and of course if you went to the right, then you were under Westminster. So it was as bonkers as that, as to when they were doing it. There was devolving powers, but Wales is still at an early stage of working out what those powers actually mean. Conscious of the time, I want to whiz through just a couple of bits of legislation. These are well worth looking at. This is the context of where lawmaking is in Wales today. The Government of Wales Act of 1998, the thing that gave us an assembly, gave us that coming together, the gathering of elected representatives in Cardiff Bay. Ministerial functions transferred to the Assembly. If you look at any piece of Welsh legislation at the moment, and particularly look at the regulations alongside it, the authority rests with Welsh ministers. This is, again, my interpretation as somebody who's a user. I think there's actually an issue around democracy here, because you've got the ministers who are leading the law, and they also determine the law. If there's an appeal within Welsh law, it's determined by Welsh ministers. They're making the law, setting the legislative agenda, they're also determining how the law is set. In UK law, it would go through the courts. In Wales, it goes back to Welsh ministers. I think there's an issue around democratic process there, but at the moment the Assembly is comfortable with that. Right, the Government of Wales Act, it set out procedures for the assemblies, it set out what the committees would do, how they would be scrutinised, it set financial parameters, put an auditor in place, which is always a good thing, and it also put public bodies there as well. Another interesting one, Welsh ministers at the moment, many public appointments are scrutinised by Welsh ministers. They are not independent. Very, very interesting. Similar to a UK government process, but a great deal of power, more power than any of us realise, is focused on Cardiff Bay. What's been delegated to Wales is massive. They only draw down a fraction of it at the moment. The Richard Commission was set up to look at the representative body of Wales, to look at the Assembly government, and really said it should be able to formulate policies within clearly defined fields. This was the start of the process and actually gave Wales law-making powers. I'll give you the PowerPoints, so don't worry about the bits in the Richard Commission, but those are key points from it. There we are, that was the vision for the Richard Commission. It should be accountable to the people of Wales through the elected Assembly for its policies and their implementation. So the Richard Commission is basically saying, give Wales law-making powers, do it within these parameters, and then the Assembly will be responsible for that. That's the process of law-making. Key bit of legislation, Government of Wales Act 2006, that was when it was given royal assent. English law or Welsh law? Or so it should say UK law or Welsh law?
English law for Wales.
Exactly. Law for Wales or law for the Welsh? Yeah, it's imposed from above. It's not quite Act of Union stuff, but it's an enabling act. The white paper there is called Better Governance for Wales, which did that. And again, it's got a National Assembly, which is the whole structure there. That's the legislative part. But it's also got an executive, the Assembly government, the elected body there. That's Karen Jones and the leading group, and then obviously the scrutiny from opposition groups. So there's legal separation there between an executive and a legislative body there within the Government of Wales Act. Okay, the Assembly was empowered to make measures when empowered, and it may assume, what that basically means was that the Assembly could come up with a measure, but it would actually have to be signed off by Westminster before it became law. So the Government of Wales Act was another stage in devolution, but it also said that the Assembly may assume primary legislative powers subject to a referendum. Now, the areas of legislative competence, as they're called, there were 20 areas. Education is the one that I'm particularly involved with. That was one where the first piece of Welsh law was actually about learner travel. That was in 2008. So 2 years after that, and I was actually involved in some of the discussion about what that piece of law looked like. So they were actually very practical things. Again, law for the Welsh coming out of those areas. But in terms of legislative competence, we needed then to go on to a referendum. The referendum, which was March 2011, it was 63.5% of people voted yes to give the Assembly lawmaking powers, 36% voted no. Unfortunately, it was a 35% turnout. So we've gone from 1979 with 4 to 1 against. We've still really only got about 25% of the people of Wales turning out to say, yeah, give us legislative competence. It's not quite Owen Glyndŵr going up into the hills with 7 people. But gosh, are Wales really serious about this? Wales, as a result, has significant lawmaking powers focused on the Assembly. And there's actually a Government of Wales Act, a bill rather, it's going to go to the UK Parliament, and I heard it mentioned on the news yesterday. That's going to look at what the process of devolving further powers may actually be. We're pretty much up to time, and I'm going to stop there. I will put up some notes and a few other pointers there. I really put this before you as to get you thinking about this. There are various themes within Welsh history I think you can use to illustrate this. At times, Wales has been profoundly in a state of mind to develop its own laws. And I wonder actually if we're going something of full circle with the classic bag law that takes us right back to Harold Dar. The issue is Wales is on the cusp of having massive powers and actually having its own legislative competence. What I don't know is whether Wales actually has the stomach to do it.
Okay, thank you very much.